Okay, I got a little long-winded. So, um, I am continuing with part two of going over just basics of using quantitative scales, psychometrically sound scales in evaluation work. So as I was talking about, I use the Conflict and Adolescence Dating Inventory, the CADRI, which is like any psychometrically valid and reliable scale. It has undergone quite a bit of study to be to the point where it's published and has been used widely by a range of researchers. And this is always a good sign that you've chosen a good measure. So what I always like to do is I use Google Scholar. So you can go in through the UTSA library homepage, and Dr. Roberta Astroff will show you how to do this on Wednesday if she doesn't ask her to do so. But I use Google Scholar on the left upper side. It'll say, since 2011 or since 2010, you can specify a range. And I always like to narrow my search starting with recent. So I usually click on like since 2013 or 2014. I narrow it that way and see what is the most recent research being done in this particular area. And then go into those articles and see what measures they're using. And you can work backwards that way. They have to give you the measures that they're using. So going into, for example, the study of teen dating violence, I can see that the CADRI is widely used. And then, of course, working backwards in time, I can see that the CADRI has been widely used. It was developed in 2001, but since there's been a short form that's been developed. Short forms are always fantastic. I'll talk about that in a second. But the original development took place in 2001. And going into that original article is really important because it will talk about the validity and the reliability. It will also give you the actual instrument, typically. So, like I said, Roberta Astroff will be there on Wednesday to talk to you about this. But as I showed you that picture of the umbrella, there is often one construct and there are multiple subconstructs within that construct. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. For example, I study relationships, and as part of relationships, sometimes there will be, for example, a relationships quality index, and that will consist of satisfaction, commitment, intimacy, and those are each part of relationship quality, which is one scale. And each of these subscales hang together. Similarly here, as part of teen dating violence, these authors have determined that physical, emotional, sexual, relational, and threatening violence are all part of teen dating violence. However, they each make up subscales. So what to look for? The original article will include a summary of how valid and reliable their instrument was with the population they tested it with. These authors assessed reliability. They looked at test-retest reliabilities, determined that that was adequate. Go to your handout to see what that is if you need a reminder. Partner agreement was acceptable. So they had observers rate different, they used two different observers, for example, rate rate couples that were in discussion of conflict, I believe it was. And that should have couples that are violent should have criterion validity, which is like a correlational validity. So you would expect, for example, couples that are highly argumentative and displaying signs of verbal aggression to score highly, at least on the verbal aggression subscale of the CADRI when they fill that out. So we're looking at things like that. They also showed measures of internal consistency, Cronbach's alphas. That's what that is, and those were strong. Internal consistency, when you see that, or when you see Cronbach's alpha, that means that items within the scale hang together well. So when you actually look at the scale, you look at the measure, each of those items should be pointing towards the same construct, or at least each of the items within each of the subscales. So if it's emotional abuse, my partner was insulting towards me, my partner put me down. Those are two statements that get at the same thing. So they have strong face validity in that way. They are also consistent internally. So that means that they're a measure of internal consistency, and the Cronbach alpha is just a statistic that's used to compute that. They also assessed validity using correlations between observers' ratings on interaction tasks. So earlier was reliability in terms of inter-rater reliability. So two people observing similarly, that they showed similar scores. And here, looking at how valid they were, are they getting at what they're supposed to get at? So correlations between observers' ratings of interaction tests, and use self-report on the Cadre. They found it for females only. So as I mentioned, validity, we would expect that, that argumentativeness, for example, is one indicator of verbal aggression. So validity is basically telling us, are we measuring what we're intending to measure? And so we should start to see that measures of the same thing correlate. Just one way to think about validity. So, to alternatively, discriminant validity would say that things that we wouldn't expect to correlate wouldn't. So teen dating violence, we wouldn't think would correlate with something like if we had a healthy relationship scale, for example. Okay. So conclusions about the Cadre, this measure isn't perfect, but it is one of the best that we've got. How do we know that? Well, this measure has been widely used and cited with diverse adolescent populations. Dr. Astroff will go over that, like how to tell who it's been normed with. So you'll want to talk to me about that in the competency assignment. Look for reviews about any given construct. Look for evidence of cross-cultural validity with diverse people, and especially for who you'll be using it with. And then also think about, using the instrument itself. We often aren't able to use a long instrument in practice, or, whether it's evaluation or single case design. So rapid assessment instruments or short form. We do sometimes compromise validity and reliability, but it's often worth it for the payoff of, it takes 10 minutes versus an hour to administer. This is an example. This is the Cadre short form. And what I would do is, in my actual work, is, and you're going to get a handout of this on Wednesday from Dr. Christensen, and you'll see in the handout, so you can compare it to this PowerPoint, is that I actually have dummy coded it, meaning that I've gone through and never, seldom, sometimes, often, I've assigned those numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 4. That way I can turn this data into something I can just enter into SPSS. You could use Excel as well, and it allows you to just compute an easy mean, standard deviation. You have descriptives. Now we're talking. Now you can actually say something meaningful about this data. Okay, the control group that didn't receive a teen dating violence prevention program, those teens had a mean of 1.2, meaning that actually they would probably have something higher. So let's say that they had a 3.1, so sometime between sometimes and often, whereas the group that did do the teen dating violence prevention, maybe they had a 2.8. So are those significant mean differences? Well, we probably want to run a t-test, but at least we can look at those mean differences now since we've dummy coded that data. We'd also want to look at standard deviation, meaning that how much did that mean score represent the population, that the sample population? How much did the average score deviate around that mean? So usually, in a scale of 1 to 4, it'd probably be about 0.5. We wouldn't see something higher than 1. If we saw something around 3, that means our data is all over the place. So how much did scores vary around the mean? That's just a recap, a reminder of what the standard deviation is. And then also you'll notice when you get that handout on Wednesday that I just go through and mark which of these items pertains to which subscale. Now keep in mind that it's okay to use subscales. Those have been validated as such. So you can say something meaningful about the emotional abuse subscale, for example, or the relational abuse subscale, but you can't say anything about any one item. So that's called cherry picking, and you can't do that. So you can't just say, oh, I really like number 4 and number 8, and I'm going to just choose to use those. You can say, I am going to just use the physical abuse subscale because that's what I'm interested in for this particular evaluation, because that's the way that this instrument was developed and normed, and it's valid that way. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to go over it again in class next week. Just ask me, or during competency assignment night if your group meets. And I talk about this a little bit here in more detail. So what I often do is just compute basic descriptives first. So easy. Find the mean, the standard deviation, and then look back to what others have found using the same measure. They have to report the descriptives too. So try not to get lost in all the other impressive things they do. They're going to show you all these fancy statistics, but just look, what is their mean? What are their percentages? What is their standard deviation? And then you would just play around with the data. You have to make it up for this assignment, but you'll want it to make sense. So if your scale of the measure that you choose ranges from 1 to 4, for example, then your mean would need to be between 1 and 4. What have others found? Go back to those articles and choose something similar to what they found. You could even pull up, start an Excel sheet and enter in some fake data, and compute a mean and standard deviation so that you can, maybe your group members could take the scale, so that you're actually getting some good practice. And then contextualize it. So what would be considered high? What would be considered low? Okay. And then utilizing culturally attuned measures. So some things you can do, be familiar with a range of measures, get expert key stakeholder opinions about it. So know your literature. That literature review really can help to know some of the cultural considerations to be thinking about. Use an intersectional lens. I really highly recommend going back to that week 1 reading on intersectionality theory. Thinking beyond race and ethnicity is a measure appropriate for differently abled individuals, for thinking across age. What about married versus unmarried or cohabiting couples, for example? Also, does it pay attention to within group heterogeneity? So is it a measure developed for Asians but not paying attention to subpopulations? And measures aren't going to be perfect, but some things that we can at least be attuned to. And then thinking about alternatives, so we can ask things qualitatively versus or in addition to quantitatively. We can use multiple measures, of course. And then, we don't want to cherry pick in terms of, I like these certain numbers, but we can make minor modifications. So for example, in my work, after piloting the measure, which I'll talk about briefly in a second, but I made the modification from Anglo to white people because that's the term that adolescents preferred. We do always want to avoid stigmatizing language, and we want to have measures translated in a way that makes sense to participants. I can't stress enough the importance of pilot testing any instruments with the population that we plan to use them with. And then just a few ideas about delivery of the instrument itself. Some things to think about when we're choosing measures. So I'm going to end with a quote here. This ever-present excess of my seeing, knowing, and possessing in relation to any other human being is founded in the uniqueness and irreplaceability of my place in the world. So be thinking about the cultural competence of your measure, and be asking Dr. Roberta Astroff too how you can choose culturally competent measures. Be speaking to me in your competency assignment about what's available. If you've chosen to use a certain measure, does it possess face validity too? So just looking at the measure and then positioning that in light of what you've learned from your literature review. So thank you for tuning into both videos, which turned out to be a half hour long worth of videos, but I hope you've benefited from them. I will not be in class tomorrow night. I will miss all of your faces, but I will see you next week. Thanks.